Hi. Today we're going to be discussing Robert E. Howard's Swords and Sorcery short story, The Rogues in the House. As is mentioned in the lecture, pulp fiction tends not to be very good writing. But Robert E. Howard can be considered one of the better pulp fiction writers. And there are a couple of different reasons for this. A lot of pulp fiction writers weren't very good because they were very rushed. Uh, Pulp fiction magazines didn't pay very well, and if you were trying to earn your living as a writer, you had to crank out story after story to make ends meet. This often led people to producing stuff that wasn't proofread, that wasn't edited, and a lot of it, as I've said, is quite bad. But Robert E. Howard was a very clever writer, okay, and he actually introduced a lot of the genre conventions that we now associate with fantasy writing. I sometimes tell creative writing students that genre can be understood as a series of shortcuts that a writer can take to really get much more quickly to the meat of a story. Now, one of the things that the lecture mentioned was this concept of the other. The lecture talks about the idea of recognizing people who are the same as us, okay, but also representing people who belong to groups that we don't consider like us, or who represent certain qualities that we don't really consider being like us, okay? And that this introduces the idea of alterity and the other with a capital O. Now, the other is very important in this particular lesson because it serves to contrast something that appears in high fantasy. In high fantasy, you have this very strict moral binary between heroes who are good and villains who are evil. In swords and sorcery fantasy, what you very often see is a protagonist, okay, and an antagonist. But rather than being separated by a very strict moral binary, there's this idea of otherness. Conan isn't really a quote-unquote good guy, okay? He's brave, he's sort of a noble savage, he's honorable, okay? But in a high fantasy sense, he's not really on the side of the angels in the same way that, say, Frodo or Bilbo or Aragorn or any of the other Tolkien characters would be. He's on his own side, which very often is the side that we would consider the good one, but he's just as likely to go and steal something or burn down a tavern or something like that, which we wouldn't really consider that good of an act. When we talk about otherness, it allows us to introduce the idea of, and this is a literary term, the idea of foils. A foil is a character which is deliberately introduced because it allows us to contrast another character. By juxtaposing a character with a character which is very different from that character, the qualities that make them different really stand out that much more. The other thing that's interesting about the other, and is particularly interesting in this lesson, is the idea that the other and the same can eventually blur. When you start out with someone being presented as very different from us, and then you show how they're the same as us, the lines between other and same sort of break down. Now, this might seem kind of confusing, and it can be, but I think you'll understand why this is important by the end of the lecture. Now, there are several different ways in which the other shows up in this particular story. The most obvious one, and the one that a lot of times you will see mentioned in one way or another in this story, is the idea that of Conan as sort of a barbarian, and then you have these civilized people that he is interacting with. Conan's barbarousness is sort of reinforced in a number of different ways. Keep in mind, when he's initially introduced in this story, he begins it in jail. And very often in Robert E. Howard's stories, Conan is introduced where he's sort of gotten in trouble with civilized society. In other stories, he begins it in a bar brawl. He's leading a group of bandits. He's the captain of a pirate ship. Okay. And there's a constant sort of reference to Conan's barbarousness throughout the story. Remember, when he is in the priest's house, he looks at the mirrors that the priest has arranged, this sort of optical illusion that allows the priest to see into a room, and he mistakes it for magic, whereas other characters are much more able to look at it and recognize it for what it is. Now, while we tend to think of a barbarian as being kind of a bad thing, for Howard, a barbarian is not necessarily that bad of a thing. In fact, it can be very good. Howard had sort of a romanticized view of history, and in it, people like Conan are much more honest. Civilization, for Howard, sort of turns people weak. It makes them, in making them more civilized, it makes them less able to act. And this is one of the recurring themes in Conan's stories. Conan is very often someone who is not a schemer himself, but gets involved in other people's schemes because they need someone who is capable of acting, who is capable of being strong, capable of being violent, and doesn't have the qualms that civilized people do. This introduces another level of otherness in this story, which is the difference between the heroic and the non-heroic in swords and sorcery fantasy. Conan is frequently a reactor in these stories. Okay, as I said, he's frequently drawn into someone else's conflict. And in Rogues in the House, the conflict is between the Red Priest, Nabonidus, and Murilo. Now, they have a conflict, and the conflict isn't very well fleshed out. And that's not really important. Really, the only reason that they have this conflict is to give Conan an excuse to kick ass. Okay? But I do want to spend just a moment talking about both of these characters. The Red Priest is introduced as sort of a powerful behind-the-scenes manipulator. Okay? And Murilo is sort of introduced as sort of this aristocrat. And there's a very telling line that I'd like to read to you. For all his scented black curls and foppish apparel, he was no weakling to bend his neck to the knife without a struggle. This is Howard's way, when he introduces this character, of telling us that he isn't like Conan. He's other than Conan. He's a civilized person, but he still has qualities that we would identify with. He's a strong-willed and proud individual, and he's not a coward. Now, this is important because the heroic in Swords and Sorcery is not the same as the heroic in high fantasy. In high fantasy, valor, self-sacrifice, things like that make the hero the hero. In Swords and Sorcery, the hero is someone who is brave, yes, but also someone who is honorable, someone who respects his debts, someone who is strong and capable. And it's not uncommon for the story, as in this particular example, in Swords and Sorcery, to see people sort of move between different states, okay, move from protagonist to antagonist and back. In this story, Conan and Murilo have come to kill the Red Priest, but when the three are forced to collaborate because there's a greater threat, Thak, the Red Priest emerges as a villain not because he's a bad person, that's why they came to kill him in the first place, but when he betrays them, that's when he becomes villainous. Now that might seem kind of confusing, but a hero in Swords and Sorcery is someone who is honorable, someone who respects their debts, okay? And the Red Priest has a debt to Conan and to Murilo that he forgets. And that's what makes him ultimately a villain and ultimately deserving of death. The lectures also touch upon the idea of the conflict between men and women in Swords and Sorcery fantasy. A lot of times, Swords and Sorcery is accused of being misogynistic, demeaning or hateful towards women. And the women in Conan stories can be strong, but Conan is always the stronger one, always the more accomplished one, always the one who is sort of rushing in to save the damsel in distress, although they're very rarely damsels. In fact, women are almost always portrayed as sexual objects in Conan stories. In some cases, whether they like it or not. I'll talk about that in a moment. Women, like the woman in this story, are often betrayers. And in another Howard short story that I considered assigning and then decided against it, called Gods of the North, basically the entire story is Conan pursuing a scantily clad woman who appears to him on this sort of Nordic battlefield and keeps running away from him, leading him off into this frozen waste. It's only revealed sort of at the end of the story that she's actually a giantess in disguise who's been luring Conan to the slaughter. And when Conan defeats her two giant brothers, afterwards he attempts to ravish her, and she's only saved by divine intervention. Keep in mind that ravish is a polite term for rape, okay? So Conan is going to rape her, and it's only that there's sort of a deus ex machina moment that saves Howard from having to show his hero engaging in something that even his contemporary viewers would probably not approve of. It's important to note that Howard is writing to his audience. Okay, at the time that Howard was writing, this is how sort of men viewed women, and that Howard, by the standards of his time, was actually pretty enlightened. He supported women in his real life. He defended them. So he wasn't quite as misogynistic as his characters come across. The lecture touched upon another way that the other can be read in this story. And in order to sort of frame this, I want to tell you about another Swords and Sorcery writer named Robert Silverberg, who's a little more contemporary. Robert Silverberg wrote a series of novels and short stories about the historical figure of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is a semi-mythological figure a Sumerian king, who's been immortalized in what may be the earliest work of literature called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, in a sort of weird and somewhat ironic twist of fate, the Epic of Gilgamesh became sort of highly influential of swords and sorcery writers. It's really kind of a knockdown, drag-out epic, and including Robert E. Howard. Robert Silverberg comes along and retells the epic in the contemporary novel form, drawing on Robert E. Howard's, the sort of traditions that Robert E. Howard establishes. Now, why is all this important? One of the Robert Silverberg Gilgamesh stories is called Gilgamesh in Hell. And in it, the In Hell series was a much broader fantasy series, which is very difficult to find now. But in it, Gilgamesh and pretty much everyone else ends up in hell. Gilgamesh is sort of wandering around in the outback of hell, and he runs into Robert E. Howard and Robert E. Howard's friend, H.P. Lovecraft, who you may remember from an earlier lecture. In a sort of literary in-joke, Robert E. Howard mistakes Gilgamesh for Conan and immediately falls in love with him. Now, there is some evidence that Robert E. Howard may have been gay. It's not really important what that evidence is, and to be frank, it isn't really important whether Robert E. Howard was gay or not. The only reason I bring this up is because a lot of people have commented on the idea of heterosexuality and homosexuality in the Conan stories. Now, for some of you, that last statement probably was pretty shocking. How can Conan, who's sort of the ultimate quote-unquote real man, have really anything to say about homosexuality? This particular story doesn't have it very strongly. You see a little bit in the sort of contrast camaraderie that develops between Conan and the foppish Murilo. But you might want to take a look at a short story called The Tower of the Elephant. Like this story, Conan spends a lot of time in that story half naked, stripped down to a loincloth. And this is a much more typical Conan story. A lot of people have commented that in the Conan stories, there's a lot of these male characters engaging in sort of activities that are not traditionally heterosexual. They spend a lot of time admiring one another's bodies, tending to one another's wounds, sort of engaged in something that's more than simply camaraderie. Now, like I said, the only reason I introduce this is to show that there are different ways that we can talk about the other, and in particular introduce this idea that the boundary between other and same can break down, which ultimately leads to the most interesting case of otherness in this particular story, okay, which is the idea of the human versus the non-human. The antagonist of this story, not villain, okay, is Thak, okay, and Thak is described as ape-like but also man-like. When he's introduced, this is what Robert E. Howard writes. "That is Thak," answered the priest, caressing his temple. "Some would call him an ape, but he is almost as different from a real ape as he is different from a real man. His people dwell far to the east, in the mountains that fringe the eastern frontiers of Zamoria. There are not many of them, but if they are not exterminated, I believe they will become human beings in perhaps 100,000 years." Now, this is a very interesting piece of writing. At the time that Howard was writing, there was a lot of misunderstanding of the notion of evolution. something that you still see some places, that people believe that evolution states, the theories of evolution states that humans evolved from apes. That wasn't Darwin's argument at all. There's also, and I'm indebted to a paper that I heard at the 2012 Popular Culture Association that was presented by a pulp scholar named Mark Finn. There's a lot to be said here about the historical scientific discoveries of apes and how they show up in the pulps. I know that may sound like a very obscure topic, but Robert E. Howard is sort of responding to reports that were emerging about apes like the chimpanzee that were poorly understood at the time, and their sort of humanness. Apes have become a symbol for something very, very different. Okay, and it's notable that the alterity that Thack is introduced with, he doesn't look human. When he's first introduced, there's a real strong emphasis on his bestial features and bestial behavior. But as the story unfolds, he becomes more and more a thinking, breathing character. At the end of the story, after Thack is killed, Howard writes this: "Black, hairy, abhorrent the monster lay, grotesque in the tatters of the scarlet robe, yet more human than bestial, even so, and possessed somehow a vague and terrible pathos. Even the Cimmerian sensed this, for he panted, 'I have slain a man tonight, not a beast. I will count him among the chiefs whose souls I've sent into the dark, and my women will sing of him.'" It's important here to reinforce something I said earlier in this little lecture, which is Thack is not a villain. The Red Priest is a villain, okay, but Thack is simply an antagonist in the story. And one of the characteristics of swords and sorcery fantasy is this idea, again, that I referenced earlier, that people can move between the status of being a hero and a villain. This will be a lot more important in some of the later lectures, like when we look at the idea of the anti-hero. Thank you very much for your time, and I will talk to you again next week.